I'm Samuel Engel. I've spent most of my career as a management consultant working in the aviation industry. I advise airlines on complex decisions about where to fly, what kind of planes to fly, how to charge customers a little bit more, and then to make decisions and move forward in consensus towards business decisions and towards action. At Questrom, I teach the MBA pricing strategy course. I teach MBA customer analytics. I teach leadership communications. And I'm also starting to teach in the Masters of Management Science program, which is actually a very exciting hands-on. It's a hands-on approach to learning that mimics the experience of being in a high-growth company. I think it's worth stepping back a little bit. The airline industry is navigating the same COVID issues and problems that many companies are navigating. And that is that there have been massive shifts in demand during the COVID era. Demand is just the decisions that each of us as individuals makes, right? And so what the airlines experienced was an incredible fall off in demand and then a resumption in demand in a different shape, where we're seeing much more leisure travel and a much slower resumption of business traffic, right? And so for airlines, the challenge is that they need to plan fairly far in advance to provide specialized equipment, people, skills, and resources. And so they need to be able to anticipate what that demand is going to look like. During the early part of the pandemic, the airlines conserved cash by shedding assets and people, right? So during the early part of the pandemic, airlines and maintenance companies laid off people, they cut back on assets, they cut back on resources. And then when the demand resumed, they've had a much harder time matching the resources to the resumption of demand and to the new demand patterns. The situation is exacerbated by two factors in particular in aviation. One is that what we're seeing is that the demand as it's resumed post-COVID is more peaky. That is, it's got more sharper highs and lower lows than it did before. It's always been the case that aviation or that air travel demand has these peaks on Fridays and around holidays and Monday mornings, right? But what we're seeing is that pattern is even more so that the summer demand is up above what it was pre-pandemic, and then the September fall off, which would ordinarily be balanced by a resumption of business traffic, is falling off more sharply than it did before the pandemic. So that's a harder situation for any business to manage, right? To provide capacity, to provide capacity when there's peaks and valleys in demand. And for airlines where there are massive investments in fixed assets as well as skilled resources, it's even harder to manage. So that's one of the issues, is that demand is more peaky. The other issue is that there has been a substantial change in pilot training requirements. The change actually took place several years ago, but it's starting to have more of an impact now. And what that change in pilot requirements looks like is that pilots are now required to accumulate more flying hours before getting an air transport pilot license, before being allowed to fly aircraft for a commercial airline, right? Such that so the regulation changed, requiring trainee pilots to get more flying experience, but they did not change the way that experience is provided. And as a result, it's on the trainee's own dime to gather all of those hours of flying, which often takes 2 to 3 years at $250,000 out of pocket, right? So you're asking individuals to pony up $250,000, 2 to 3 years of their life, flying around in a small propeller plane to gather hours so as to be able to qualify for a license to fly a very complex, large aircraft, right? So the regulation may have been well intended, but it has certainly had difficult consequences for the industry and for the industry staffing. So what we have is, as that demand has been resuming, the number of pilots has actually been declining. What we are, the expectation in the industry is that this year the industry will need to hire between 12,000 and 15,000 new pilots. And the trainee processes, right, the individuals who are signing up for and going through training is numbering about 6,000 per year. So we're producing right now half as many pilots as we need to staff the industry. That impact is sort of rolling through the system. And what that means, if you take it together and you consider both the higher peaks that we're seeing in demand, as well as the reduced staffing levels, what you end up with is a system that is less, I don't want to say stable, because stable almost implies that there's a safety issue, and it's not a safety issue. There's less resilience in the system, right? There's less give. So ordinarily, when flights get canceled or delays, you have a fair bit of, you have multiple options for how you can patch the schedule and how you can get passengers where they need to go. And what happens with the higher demand and the lower staffing is that you just have less flexibility. There's less resilience in the system. I call it, what I call it is brittle. It's as if the plans for the operations just have less room for adjustment over the course of the day. And we're feeling it as passengers, right? I don't have to tell you. Anybody who has flown this summer has some of that experience, or at least the fear of that experience of, this flight was delayed, that wouldn't have been a big deal, and suddenly it might be a big deal. The staffing issue is not just the establishment. It's not just the cadre of pilots that are available. The pilots are getting sick just like the rest of us, right? I mean, now that we're in a post-COVID era, we all just go about getting sick and leaving work. And that same thing is happening in the cockpit and on board, and it's happening on the ramp, and it's happening at check-in. So the airlines are managing the same staffing complexities that every company in America is managing, but they're managing it in an environment where their workforce is highly skilled, highly regulated, and has less backup. Listen, the impact on customers is not a secret. Anybody who's flown is aware of the impact in terms of the operational issues, but the impact on customers is also being felt in terms of higher fares. And there's a couple reasons that the fares are increasing. One reason is the same supply constraints that are existing throughout the economy that are contributing to the broader inflation patterns, right? So as there are fewer flights and there's more peak demand for those flights, the fares go up. That's just a natural match of the supply and the demand curve, right? That's economics. But there's something else that's going on, which is that we have all been accustomed to a cross-subsidy between business travel and leisure travel that has quietly taken place in the background for decades. That is, it has been the case since deregulation in 1979. So since the airline industry pursued regular commercial economic pricing, there is a spectrum of prices on offer, and in general, the customers who are traveling for business have been paying higher fares than the customers who are traveling to visit grandma in Florida, right? And that's all been well and good. We've certainly enjoyed being able to visit grandma for cheap. But the way that that's getting covered to a certain degree is by the business travelers who are paying higher fares. What we've seen in the pandemic recovery is that leisure traffic has zoomed right back up, in fact, even above the levels that it was before the pandemic, and business travel has been much, much slower to resume, just like the return to the office has been slower to resume, right? So the number of business travelers who are paying the higher fares, the $600 and $800 fares, that would ordinarily be enabling airlines to offer lower fares at the low end, is out of the balance that we're used to. And that contributes to an increase in leisure fares, which is what we as consumers tend to feel, right? We're all consumers through business, but we tend to feel those fares that we're buying for our holidays. So that's kind of the direct consumer impact is the operational experience, as well as the fare impact. So the first thing is in direct response to the need for more pilots, the airlines have been investing in training academies or training programs that let them take more control of the pipeline of future pilots. It used to be that the combination of flight schools and regional airlines created a sufficient pipeline of pilots that would feed the U.S. major airlines without the airlines needing to intervene earlier in that process. So now the airlines have been, each one in its own way, building up various kinds of programs that help fund trainees and align them for a job later with various kinds of loans and paybacks. So the airlines are investing in training academies. That's not new for the industry. That's actually been common outside the U.S. but it wasn't necessary in the US for many years. And so now the large airlines have started to do that. So that's one response that you're seeing. There's also, of course, some lobbying of Congress to relax the rule. It's called the 1,500-hour rule. There's been some efforts to work with the government to try to relax that rule. It's very unlikely that politicians will actually vote to relax that rule because it's highly emotional, and the families of the crash victims who preceded that regulation are very vocal in Congress. But there are some discussions at the executive level of ways to create a provisional flying license that would allow essentially pilots with fewer hours to work in the cockpit alongside a seasoned captain. But basically, so reaction one from the airlines is that they're investing in more structured training programs to secure their pilot pipeline. Reaction two is that the airlines are adjusting their schedules. So the flights that get cut tend to be the flights in the smaller aircraft, right? If you're limited in the number of pilots, what you do is you prioritize those resources on the larger aircraft. So what we've seen is quite a number of cancellations or route cancellations by the regional airlines and the airlines that are operating to smaller destinations. That's impacting small communities. But it is, in some cases, it's being managed by consolidating multiple flights in smaller aircraft into fewer flights in larger aircraft, right? So we see that we're seeing basically generally schedule rationalization of one sort or another to manage that change in resources and demand. The last thing, though, that the airlines are doing is it looks more like a step removed, but it's actually quite interesting, and that is that we are seeing a new round of consolidation taking place in the US airline industry that we haven't seen now for a number of years. So there was just a quite public multi-month-long battle to acquire Spirit Airlines. Both Frontier Airlines and JetBlue were bidding for Spirit Airlines, which is one of the largest low-cost airlines and the largest that operates the so-called ultra-low fare or ultra-low-cost model. And that consolidation, as always, is driven by a desire to achieve scale efficiencies and to be able to rationalize the network, to be able to rationalize the flying network or the route network, so that airlines can provide a more efficient schedule and ultimately also charge for they get more control of the pricing environment. But the other motivation that's driving the consolidation this time around, which we haven't seen before, is a desire to acquire capacity. So it's not a secret that one of the reasons JetBlue was so eager to acquire Spirit is that with Spirit, they're acquiring ready certified aircraft and pilots who are able to fly them from day one. So it's a very interesting continuation or push towards more consolidation in the industry in response to not only the change in demand, but also the change in available resources. You know, people ask me this. I've been in aviation now for over 25 years. I have seen the crises following September 11th. I've seen the crises following the 2009 global financial crisis. I've seen other localized crises. I've seen disruption of transatlantic flights due to volcanoes. And every time what I hear people say is, "Oh, is this the end of aviation? People aren't going to travel anymore. They're too concerned about the environmental impact." And every time what we see is within a period of just a few years that demand resumes. And I think as we've all been trying to understand, we look at the disruption that's taken place in our lives from the pandemic, and we ask ourselves, what part of that disruption is uncovering something that was ready to change? And what part of that disruption is in fact a disruption into something that's basic human behavior that needs to resume? So I think the jury may still be out on part of the need for daily presence in the office, right? But what's not under question at all is the need for human beings to be together. I mean, what we have seen And we've learned painfully through loneliness and impact on families and mental health and in many other ways. What we've seen is that the need for human beings to come together, to be together physically, to see each other's faces, to laugh and to talk and to feel the warmth of one another's bodies is deeply, deeply human. And it's just not negotiable. And that's why not only is the outlook for aviation, I would say, robust from the perspective of an observer, but the data have already shown us that demand is robust. The evidence that I point to, that I find most compelling, is the first summer of the pandemic, not after the pandemic, but the first summer of the pandemic when we didn't have vaccines yet. And the airlines got surprised by a massive burst in demand for leisure travel that summer. People were taking personal risk, but they needed to travel. They needed to be together. And that's why it's not so surprising that the leisure travel has resumed so thoroughly, whereas the business travel is much slower and is taking its own path. So I think long-term, the outlook for air travel demand is not fundamentally different than it has been before. It may take a slightly different shape. And remember, what we see in the US is basically a mature industry, whereas in large parts of Asia, both in China and South Asia, as well as other countries, we've been watching a takeoff, if you'll bear the pun, of demand for air travel that has been fueled by the rise of low-cost airlines and fueled by deregulation and the rising middle class, that as soon as people have the money, they want to fly and they want to travel. So from a demand perspective, the outlook for aviation is robust. You might ask me, what's the outlook for the industry from a supply and cost structure standpoint, right? We're now managing fuel at $3 and $4 a gallon, when for most of the last 40 years, aviation fuel has been much closer to $1.50 a gallon. We're looking at higher costs of carbon. We're looking at all sorts of changes to input costs. And what I would say to you is that the industry has shown an ability to recalibrate to different cost structures over time. So it is true that if the cost of fuel rises from $1 a gallon to $4 a gallon, there will be a period of disruption while the supply and demand rebalance, and while those routes which cannot be profitable at $4 a gallon get dropped out of the system, or the late night flights get dropped out of the system, right? There's an adjustment that takes place. But once that adjustment has taken place, the industry resumes a balance and continues apace. During that process of adjustment, there are winners and losers. And we've already seen over the last 3 years a significant adjustment that's taken place, where we've had dozens and dozens of airlines either go bankrupt, go into some kind of government-supervised restructuring, depending on the laws of each country, and cease operations. So that process, it's a very healthy process in any industry of external change comes in, it affects the demand, it affects the cost structure, the incumbents adapt, newcomers come in with innovation and new technology, we reach a new stasis, and it moves on from there.